Why was The Last of Us Online cancelled? Well. There are many reasons. In 2013, The Last of Us was released by Naughty Dog for the PlayStation 3, and it was a fantastic game, taking narrative in video games to a new level. But aside from the main story, The Last of Us included a 4 versus 4 competitive multiplayer mode called Factions. To the surprise of many, Factions was well received by players, and the multiplayer mode built a fanbase. Factions blended the cinematic narrative of the main story with the intense combat, stealth, and resource crafting to survive the match. Factions wasn't just a mode for shooting around. No, my friends. It involved players choosing a faction, either the Hunters or the Fireflies, and managing a clan for 12 in-game weeks. And that's the reason Factions made a strong impact on the multiplayer games market. So much so that the mode is still active on PS4 and PS5 consoles, with the remaster of The Last of Us. Sony and Naughty Dog saw the potential of a multiplayer mode based on The Last of Us universe. And that's why in 2016 a group of developers at Naughty Dog began working on a live service that could be considered the spiritual successor to Factions. The year 2020 arrived, and with it, the sequel to Ellie and Joel's story in The Last of Us Part 2. But players realized that this time the game didn't include a multiplayer mode, one aspect that fueled the rumor about a full-fledged game focused on Factions-style multiplayer. And it was true. Part of Naughty Dog was working on a live service called The Last of Us Online. This project gained much more momentum during the time when Jim Ryan, aka Mr. Live Service, was at the helm of Sony PlayStation. Jim Ryan, in my opinion, negatively transformed Sony PlayStation's internal philosophy. Under Ryan's leadership, the company focused on developing online multiplayer games, trying to emulate Epic Games' success with Fortnite, leaving behind the legacy of single-player narrative games that had made the Japanese company great in the video game world. That's why The Last of Us Online project, under Mr. Live Services' reign, received substantial financial backing and support. Naughty Dog's online project was thriving. It was going incredibly well, especially since Sony hit the jackpot with its online game Helldivers 2. Ryan and the new Sony were pleased with the success of the online alien killing shooter, but the tide in the horizon was beginning to rise and became stormy. Longtime Sony PlayStation fans began to raise their voices, annoyed and worried to learn the single-player game projects focused on narrative and gameplay were being cancelled and replaced by purely online game projects under the Sony PlayStation umbrella. And also, a tomahawk punch that almost left the giant Sony breathless was the mega flop of the multiplayer online game called Concord. That's where James Ryan's vision, along with Herman Holst, another accomplice in this disastrous prospect of turning Sony PlayStation into a live service company, began to falter. Jim Ryan, Mr. Live Service, left the throne at Sony PlayStation after the Concord debacle, and Naughty Dog saw the influx of financial support from its owner dwindle for The Last of Us Online project. Sony PlayStation recognized and reconsidered that this vision of live services games was not the right call. Therefore, after 7 years of development and with almost 80% of the game completed, Sony PlayStation and Naughty Dog decided to cancel the project called The Last of Us Online. In my opinion, and I repeat, in my opinion, a colossal mistake. Recently, the director of The Last of Us Online, Vineet Agarwal, clarified many questions that have been circulating through the interweb about the cancelled game. Agarwal said in several interviews that Naughty Dog had to make decisions about which projects to invest time and money in. There were two options: start working on the next project led by the studio's president, Neil Druckmann, or work on an online game that was nearing completion after 7 years of development. And guess what? Yes, my friends, no surprises there. Sony PlayStation decided to greenlight Druckmann's project. It's well known that Druckmann wields a considerable power at Sony PlayStation, and I personally have a very negative opinion of Druckmann. I find him to be an arrogant individual who thinks he's a scholar of literary narrative art, and that his views are the only correct ones, beyond reproach. There's no denying that Mr. Druckmann has a talent of crafting stories, but I think fame has gone to his head. According to Agarwal, one of the reasons Sony PlayStation chose Naughty Dog's new project, Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet, over the online game The Last of Us Online was because it was a familiar territory, and those who chose the new project had a point, I may say. Naughty Dog thought about their survival and its future, so they made a hard choice. Intergalactic is a single-player game with his cinematic storytelling, something Naughty Dog excels at. In contrast, the online project was an experiment, a shot in the dark for the video game studio behind Jak and Daxter and Uncharted. Agarwal also shared his pain and disappointment upon learning of the cancellation of the multiplayer game he had worked on for 7 years, a game he believed will be very well received by players. It was a devastating blow for him, and he knew about the cancellation 24 hours before it was public. There was one event that influenced Sony PlayStation's decision to cancel or abandon ship of The Last of Us Online. This event was the visit from Bungie Studios developers to review and evaluate Naughty Dog's game. Bungie, the creators of Halo and Destiny, are experts in online multiplayer games, and after reviewing The Last of Us Online, they criticized the game for lacking the appeal to keep players coming back after a while, a crucial factor in any live service game. Another element that contributed to the game's cancellation was the fear or concern that Sony PlayStation and Naughty Dog had when they realized the time, financial resources, and human labor required for post-launch live service game. Naughty Dog hadn't planned for that aspect from the beginning, and as a creative studio, they didn't want to stop developing new single-player projects. It was one or the other. The two options couldn't coexist simultaneously. But I say, after 7 years, 80% of development completed, and Naughty Dog having not released anything new in a long time, dude, just release the game, man. They could have turned the live service into a 70 multiplayer game like the old times, and occasionally offered new weapons and maps, without microtransactions. That could have worked, in my humble opinion, of course. But well, the video game industry is known for its tenacity. One misstep and the dominoes of the entire company or studio start to crumble. Maybe the mistake was to start the online project from the beginning, just for searching the gold mine at the end of the rainbow. I hope Naughty Dog's new project, Intergalactic, is successful, because I am a proponent of single-player games with narrative and cinematic gameplay. Good luck, Naughty Dog. Good luck.